Welcome to 10 minutes lectures in computer science. In this lecture, let us discuss about the transaction execution states under the topic transaction management in database management systems. A transaction is a collection of operations that form a single logical unit of work. A transaction is considered as a logical unit of work to ensure the data integrity. Hence, it cannot be decomposed into multiple smaller instructions. For example, money transfer from one account to another involves two update operations. The first one deduces the money from the source account, and the second one adds the amount to the destination account. And these two instructions part of a single transaction, then we would say that the money transfer is successful. Likewise, we have so many examples like uh, creating an inventory management. It involves creation of orders and decrease the uh, stock quantity from one table and adding payment record into another table and so on. Each one involves individual instructions to be executed as part of a single transaction. Before going to the topic, let us see about some important keywords. As we have just discussed about a transaction is a single logical unit of work which may consist of one or more instructions that may insert a record or update a record or delete a record. We need to mark the boundary of every transaction using the instructions begin transaction and end transaction. So the other keyword is abort. It is to mark the transaction is a failed one. Hence, we need to roll back or undone that particular transaction. Other keyword is to commit. So commit is to ensure that all the changes were done to the database were correct and accepted so that we say that that particular transaction is committed. This is the state transition diagram of transactions. A transaction can be in any of these states based on the instructions that it executes and other conditions it meets. So active state, every transactions in an active state once it starts its execution. And as transactions said to be in a partially committed state if all the instructions of that particular transaction is completed. And the transaction is in committed state if we execute the commit successfully. If any failure of instructions or anything happens, the transaction may go from active state to failed state or even from partially committed state to failed state. Once a transaction reaches failed state, it has to be aborted. That is, it has to be rolled back to the old consistent state. Every transaction that starts its execution is said to be in active state. For example, this particular transaction, which updates the data item X by deducting 5,000 from it. Now, when we start with begin transaction and we start executing each instruction from this particular transaction, we say that the transaction is in active state. From active state, if the transaction is aborted, it will enter into failed state. The transaction enters into the failed state if it is aborted by the user or maybe the concurrency control protocol or due to the failure of the system. It may be a system failure or power failure, whatever it is. So for these reasons, a transaction which is in an active state may be aborted. For instance, a user may want to stop the transaction for some reason, that is cancel the transactions for some reasons, or the concurrency control protocol may not be able to get locks on a particular transaction, hence it may be aborted, or due to the failure of something. In these cases, the transaction may go from active state to failed state. A transaction may go from active state to partially committed state if it reaches end of the transaction. That is, it completes all the execution of the transaction and it reaches end transaction. We say that that particular transaction is partially committed. And there is a possibility that a partially committed transaction also can enter into a failed state due to some reasons. For example, this may happen due to the serializability violation or some integrity constraint violated or due to some system failure. It may be a power failure or system crash, whatever it is. A partially committed state may enter into a failed state. A transaction can enter into a committed state from partially committed state upon the execution of commit instruction. This happens if all the instructions of the transaction is completed successfully. Also, everything goes well, we need to log necessary information for recovery purpose, and then commit is executed successfully. We say that the transaction entered into committed state. So for example, in this transaction, if we assume that the value of X before the transaction was 10,000, then at the committed state, the value of X will be 5,000. All the instructions were executed successfully, and this value, new value of X will be written into the hard disk. And from a failed state, a transaction can only enter into aborted state. So all the failed transactions are considered as aborted. That means they are going to be rolled back to the old consistent state. For instance, if this transaction is not able to complete successfully, in that case, the old value of X will be written back to the hard disk. That is, value 10,000 will be retained by the hard disk. So any changes made to the data item during this intermediate stage will be reverted back to the original value of X. So in this lecture, we discussed about various states a transaction can be in. A transaction, when it starts its execution, it's said to be in active state, and from active state, it can go to either partially committed state or failed state. If all the instructions are executed successfully, it is said to be entered into a partially committed state. If something goes wrong, we say that it is entered into failed state. And from partially committed state, if you are able to execute the commit instruction as a final one, then it enter into a committed state. Otherwise, if it fails to execute during this partially committed state, then it is entering into failed state. From failed state, it only can go into a aborted state. Thank you. For any queries, you can visit explorerdatabase.com.